The Quarry dumped rocks on her land. She turned it all into $1 million business. Martha Holloway woke up to the smell of diesel and the sound of heavy engines invading the silence of the early morning. By the time she reached the property gate, it was already too late to stop anything. The damage was done, spread across more than 2/3 of her land, and the man responsible for it all was still there, leaning against the truck door, with an expression that mixed indifference and defiance. It was on that cold morning that she first heard the name of the man who would try to destroy everything she had. Sterling Vance, owner of the neighboring quarry, had just dumped tons of raw rocks onto the land she had inherited from her husband, where she had raised her children, and which represented her only security in the world, and he did it without warning, without agreement, and without any shame. "Do you have a problem with this?" he said, crossing his arms with the deep voice of someone used to not being questioned. Martha stood still for a second, just 1 second. Then she looked at the rocks scattered across her land, at the men still unloading the rest, at the truck with the Quarry logo painted on its side, and took a deep breath. "Yes," she replied, with a calmness that even surprised herself. "I have a big problem with this." Sterling let out a short laugh, almost a grunt, and pointed a thick finger at her. "Your husband verbally authorized this disposal before he passed. There's nothing in writing because a man of his word doesn't need paper. You have no way to prove otherwise, so I suggest you accept it and go about your life." Martha felt the ground give way a little under her feet, but she didn't let it show on her face. Arthur had passed away 2 years ago, taken by a swift and unforgiving illness, and since then she had managed the property alone, with her children living in the city, and her sister-in-law spreading gossip she'd rather not repeat. She had no documents about that alleged agreement, no witnesses, no money for a lawyer, and Sterling knew all of that before he even released the first truck. When the vehicles finally drove off down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dry dust that took minutes to settle, Martha was left alone in the middle of those rocks. Some were as big as barrels, others, smaller, were piled up on the dry grass. The land that once opened up as green pasture now looked like the bottom of an abandoned rock quarry. She walked slowly among the rocks, still not knowing what she would do, but certain she wouldn't just stand still waiting for someone to come and fix things for her. It had never worked that way. It wasn't going to start now. In the following days, life went on with the silent brutality that only those who live in the countryside know. Martha tried to talk to 2 neighbors who had business with the quarry and might have heard something about the supposed agreement. Neither of them wanted to get involved. The first said he didn't know anything. The second looked away and changed the subject before she could finish her question. The community of that small town, nestled in the middle of the high prairie, worked as it had always worked. Sterling Vance was influential, had partners everywhere, provided jobs for many families, and no one in their right mind would go against him over a widow with a rock-filled piece of land. Martha understood this without needing anyone to explain it, so she went to Sterling's office. The place was in a simple building by the main road, but it had an air of trying to seem bigger than it was. She walked in without announcing herself, crossed the waiting room with the firm steps of someone who knows their own ground, and asked to speak with him. The receptionist went to tell him. Martha waited standing. Sterling received her with a smile she recognized from a distance. It was the smile of someone who has already decided they're going to win and is just waiting for the other side to give in. "Mrs. Martha." What a surprise. He gestured to the chair in front of him. "Have a seat." She sat down. "I came to talk about the dumping you did on my land," she said, straight to the point. "I've already explained all this to you. Your husband—" "My husband left nothing in writing." She interrupted him softly but without backing down. "And you know as well as I do that a verbal agreement between 2 people dies with one of them." Sterling leaned forward, clasped his hands on the table, and looked at her with calculated patience. "You're in a tough spot, I understand. But the land is compromised now. Full of rock, no use for farming for years. What I can do is make things easier for you by buying it all for a fair price. You walk away with cash in hand, head into town to be near your kids, live worry-free." Martha didn't answer right away. She looked at his hands, at the watch on his wrist, at the expensive pen on the table. Then she looked into his eyes. "How much are you offering?" He told her the amount. It was a number that made the land sound like it was worth nothing, as if the rocks he'd dumped there himself had deliberately devalued everything, which was exactly what had happened. Martha got up from the chair. "Thanks for the coffee," she said, even though no coffee had been offered. And she left. When she was almost at the door, she heard laughter coming from the back of the office. It wasn't loud laughter. It was that low, controlled kind of laughter people let out when they think they're out of earshot of the person who just left. That sound got under Martha's skin and stayed there, quiet, festering. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. She headed back to the property in the late afternoon. The sun was already low, orange, hitting the scattered rocks sideways and casting long shadows over the trampled grass. Martha walked slowly across the land, as she did when she wanted to think, but today her thoughts wouldn't sort themselves out. They came in pieces, like broken shards. It happened almost by accident. The old grinding wheel was still on the back porch, leaning against the wooden wall, covered in a thin layer of dust that proved no one had used it in ages. Arthur had bought the equipment to polish tools and simple parts, one of those practical items country folks like to have on hand, even if they don't use it often. Martha walked past it without paying attention, but then she tripped on one of the smaller stones that had rolled near the porch, grabbed it instinctively to toss it back onto the pile, and for some reason she couldn't explain later, she stopped. The stone felt different from the others, not lighter, denser somehow, as if it had something locked inside. She placed it on the grinding wheel, picked up a hammer that Arthur used to keep hanging on the wall, and she struck it, not with angry force, but with that curiosity of someone who has nothing to lose in that moment. The stone split cleanly in half with a sharp crack, and what appeared inside made Martha drop the hammer on the ground without noticing. Crystals, red and green, intense, deep, shining with a color that didn't seem to belong to that arid, dry land. The afternoon light came through the crack in the porch and hit those irregular facets directly, breaking into reflections that danced on the wooden wall. It was as if the stone had held a storm inside for years and years, waiting for someone to strike the right spot to open it. Martha knelt there, not by choice, but because her legs simply gave out. She stared for a long time, a stretch she couldn't measure. Then she carefully picked up the two pieces, as if they were fragile, and carried them inside the house. That night she didn't sleep. She just stared at the crystals on the kitchen table, with the yellow light of the lamp hitting them, trying to understand what she was seeing. She knew there were precious stones in the high prairie, everyone had a vague sense of it, but she'd never heard of anything like this in the area. And if that was in one rock, there could be in others, in many others. The next morning she wrapped the fragment in a clean dish towel, put it in her bag, and went to the township fair. The fair happened on Fridays in the central square and had a bit of everything: fruit, spices, clothes, handicrafts. But Martha went to a specific corner she'd passed dozens of times without stopping, where an elderly man displayed a small collection of minerals on a table covered with a faded blue cloth. The man, named Abraham but everyone called Old Abe, was nearly 70, with completely white hair and a worn-out magnifying glass that looked like it had traveled the world with him. Martha placed the fragment on the table without saying a word. Old Abe picked up the magnifying glass, examined it, turned the piece over, examined it again. He was silent for so long that Martha started to think she'd done something foolish. Then he lowered the magnifying glass and looked at her. "Where did you find this?" he asked, with a voice so calm it sounded rehearsed. "On my land," she replied. He nodded slowly, like someone confirming an old suspicion. "This is a combination of tourmaline and amethyst. It's not common to find the two together in a single crystal, especially with this intensity of color." He paused. "Do you know how much a piece like this would be worth in a specialized market?" Martha said she didn't. He told her the price. She had to hold on to the edge of the table. It was more than she earned in a whole month of work on the property, and that was one stone, a single stone from a pile that had hundreds. "If the rest of what you have on your land is similar," said Old Abe, with the caution of a man who'd seen people get excited too soon, "you could be sitting on something very serious." Martha left the fair a different person from when she'd entered. It wasn't just anger and stubbornness anymore. It was anger, stubbornness, and now a spark lit in her chest that she didn't yet know was hope or just desire. But it was something, and it was hers. She spent the next week breaking rocks. Alone, in the late afternoons after the midday heat had subsided a bit, she used Arthur's hammer, leather gloves she found in the shed, and the grindstone as a work surface. For every rock she opened that showed nothing, she tossed it aside. For every rock that showed some crystal, she carefully set it aside in a wooden box she found serving as a shelf support. In 10 days she had filled 3 boxes. Not all of them were as spectacular as the first. Some only had tiny veins of color, almost imperceptible. But some were extraordinary, with formations that looked like they'd been sculpted from within over centuries of pressure and time. The neighbors watched her from a distance. She knew that. She felt their gazes when she bent her back over the rocks, when the hammer echoed in the silence of the afternoon. No one came to ask what she was doing, but everyone for sure was talking. And then her sister-in-law, Beatrice, showed up. Beatrice was Arthur's sister, a woman with hair dyed a red that was already fading at the tips, with the air of someone who always showed up at the wrong time in the most important moments of other people's lives. She lived a few miles away, had 2 adult daughters who lived in the city, and spent her days going from house to house in the community with stories she shaped according to her audience. "Martha, my dear," she said, getting out of the car with an expression of concern that didn't fool anyone. "What's this story I hear about you smashing rocks in the middle of the lot like a crazy woman?" Martha didn't stop what she was doing. "It's not a story, Beatrice. I'm working." "Working?" Beatrice looked at the rocks with a look that mixed disdain and confusion. "Sweetheart, this is just rubble. Sterling dumped trash on your land, and you're playing with his trash. Sell it all, leave, start a new life." "I already have a life," said Martha without looking up. Beatrice stood still for a moment, then shook her head with that gesture of someone declaring they've washed their hands of it. "You've been troubled ever since Arthur left. Everyone sees it, except you." She made a calculated pause. "I'm calling Nathan. Someone needs to knock some sense into this situation." Martha stopped the hammer. She looked up at her sister-in-law. "You can call whoever you want, Beatrice, but as long as I don't ask for help, no one's going to solve anything for me here." Beatrice left the way she came, not getting what she wanted, but carrying enough material to make the gossip grow. And it grew. 3 days later, Nathan called. Nathan was Martha's oldest son, 32 years old, worked as an analyst at a company in the big city, and had inherited from his father that cold rationality that sometimes sounded more like judgment than concern. He was a good son, Martha knew that, but he was a son who understood the world in numbers and probabilities, and the idea that his mother was smashing rocks alone on a lot full of rubble didn't show up well on any spreadsheet. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, in that tone of someone who's not really asking if you're okay, but asking if you've got your head on straight. "I'm working," she answered. "Aunt Beatrice said you're smashing rocks on the lot, that you're alone, that you're hurting yourself." "My hands are calloused, Nathan. I didn't hurt myself." There was a pause. "Do you want me and Caleb to come over this weekend?" Martha looked at the boxes of crystals leaning against the porch wall. She thought for a second. "You can come," she said. They arrived on Saturday morning, the 2 of them in one car. Caleb, the younger son, was 28 and had a bigger heart than his brother, but also much less ability to hide when he was worried. He came hugging his mother longer than usual, and Martha felt in that hug everything he didn't know how to say. She took them to the lot without much introduction. She showed them the rocks. She showed them the boxes with the crystals. She opened a rock in front of them with the hammer on the grinding stone and let them both see what appeared inside. Caleb's mouth fell open. Nathan stared for long seconds. Then he crossed his arms. "Mom, I understand it looks promising," he said with his usual controlled voice. "But you're here alone without technical knowledge, without proper equipment, smashing rocks in the heat. You don't know if this has real value. You don't know if there's enough quantity. and you're wearing yourself down physically over something that might come to nothing." "It's already come to something," she said, and went to get the paper where she'd written down what old Abe said about the value of the crystal. Nathan looked at the paper, read it, looked again. "That's the opinion of an old man at a fair," he said, handing the paper back. "It's not an official appraisal. Mum, Sterling's offer." "No," Martha interrupted him, with a firmness that didn't shout but didn't bend either. "You didn't even hear what I was going to say. You were going to say to accept his offer, and the answer is no." Nathan took a deep breath. "Then at least let us hire someone to properly evaluate this before you keep smashing everything." "When I have the money to hire someone, I will," she said. "For now, I'll learn what I need to learn the way I know how. By reading." On Sunday night, when the two of them left, she hugged them by the car door with genuine warmth. She loved her children, but she felt a sense of relief when the car's taillights faded down the road. Caleb had been quiet for most of the visit. When it was time to leave, while Nathan already had his hand on the door handle, he stood still facing his mother with that look of someone who has something to say but doesn't quite know how. "Mum," he said softly, "you seem different." "Different how?" He thought for a second. "More steady. You know when a person is steady, but it seems like any wind could knock them over. That's not you. You're steady in a different way." She didn't answer right away. She stood looking at her youngest son with that look mothers save for moments when their children say something true without realizing they're saying it. "Go on," she said, and gave his arm a light tap. Martha stood for a moment at the gate after the lights disappeared down the road, thinking about what Caleb had said. Steady in a different way. It was the difference between standing because someone is holding you up and standing because you found your own balance. She was learning that difference firsthand, stone by stone. On Monday morning, she went to the library. The public county library was in an old brick building, with large windows that let in more draft than light. It smelled of old paper and wood, and the shelves reached nearly to the ceiling, organized with a care you only see in places where someone truly loves what they do. That someone was Mrs. Clara. Clara Whitfield was 63 years old, wore glasses with thick lenses that made her eyes look twice their natural size, and had a memory for book titles that left people speechless. She had worked at the library for nearly 40 years and knew every corner of that collection the way you know your own children. Martha arrived without much of a plan. She apologized for not knowing exactly what she was looking for, explained in a few words what she had found in the stones, and Mrs. Clara listened to her entirely without interrupting once. When Martha finished, the librarian was silent for a moment, then got up from her chair with a surprising agility for her age and went straight to a shelf in the back. She came back with 2 books on the geology of the high prairie and 1 on the artisanal cutting of minerals, all with markers made of aged cardboard in the chapters she had deemed relevant even before knowing she'd need them. "These are a good place to start," she said, placing the books on the table with a gentleness that contrasted with the decisiveness of her gesture. "You come back when you've read them, and I'll pass you more." There was no ceremony, there was no unsolicited advice, just books and the silent camaraderie of a woman who understood the value of wanting to learn. Martha spent 3 days reading. She read about the geological formation of the high prairie, about the conditions that create mineral veins, about how to identify tourmalines and amethysts with the naked eye, about the signs that differentiate a stone with mining potential from one that has nothing. She read about artisanal cutting, about types of cuts, about polishing. She read early in the morning, she read at night by the dim lamplight, she read with a notebook beside her, jotting down what she understood and marking what she didn't, to ask Mrs. Clara. And it was during this reading process that she returned to the lot with new eyes. Now she saw what she previously couldn't name. She saw how the stones had been dumped. Most arrived mixed together without order like plain rubble. But there was a group of stones in the east corner of the lot that was different. These had extraction marks, not the careless marks of someone dumping debris. They were precise marks, with fracture patterns that the books described as the result of specific tools. Someone had extracted these stones from somewhere with care. Martha stood before them for a long time. Then she went to get the notebook and started photographing the marks with her old cell phone that could barely make decent calls. She kept the observation to herself. She still didn't understand the weight of it, but something deep in her gut told her she needed to hold on to it. She was back at her sorting work late on a Thursday afternoon when she heard the familiar engine of a heavy vehicle coming up the road. She stepped out from behind the pile of stones and saw a large black car with the Quarry's logo on the door stop at the entrance to the property. Sterling Vance got out alone, but he didn't come with that condescending smile from last time. This time his face was closed off, controlled, with the kind of look someone has when they're about to play a card they've saved for just the right moment. "Mrs. Martha," he said, walking slowly, his eyes scanning the boxes of crystals on the porch. "I noticed you're trying to make use of the material that was deposited here. I respect that. A hard-working woman." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and held it out to her. "But before you go any further, you need to see this." Martha took the envelope without any hurry. She opened it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper that looked old, covered in fine print, with signatures and stamps trying to appear official. "What is this?" she asked, skimming it. "It's a document proving that the eastern strip of your land, right where the highest quality stones are, was granted to the former quarry owner decades ago, even before your husband bought the land." He crossed his arms. "You're working on property that isn't yours, legally speaking." Martha folded the paper. She handed the envelope back. "I'll take a careful look at this," she said. Sterling took the envelope with a satisfaction he tried to hide. "Of course. But you understand that until this is sorted out, it would be reasonable to pause any work on that strip." "Good afternoon," said Martha, and she turned her back. She heard his car drive off while she was back at the work table, but her hands had stopped moving. She stared at the box of crystals in front of her for a time she couldn't measure. That night was the heaviest of the whole journey, not from crying. Martha wasn't a woman who cried easily. It was from anger, that cold, dry anger that clenches your jaw and doesn't come out in a single tear. She sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open, looking out at the dark window, thinking about the document, the stamp, the signatures. Something about that paper wasn't right. She didn't know exactly what, but she had a feeling, like when you read a sentence and understand the words are in the right place, but the meaning is twisted. There was something in that document that grated. The next morning, she photographed the entire paper with her cell phone and went to the county registrar. The county registrar's office had a smell of paper and ink that seemed to have soaked into the walls over the decades. Behind the counter was a man with completely white hair and thin glasses named Mr. Silas, who had worked there for 42 years, according to what he told her when she asked. Martha showed him the photos of the document on her phone. Mr. Silas took the device with 2 fingers, brought it close to his glasses, examined it with that patient attention of someone who has spent a lifetime surrounded by documents and learned to read between the lines as much as what's written on them. After a long moment, he handed the phone back. "Where did you find this?" he asked, with a neutrality that said a lot. "It was presented to me as proof of a land grant," she explained. He nodded slowly, like someone sorting out what he can and can't say. "I can't give any official opinion on a document I don't have in hand," he said, but informally. The typeface used in the body of the text didn't exist at the time this document is dated. It was created later. Martha stood still for a second. "So it's a fake." "What I can tell you is that it would be very hard to explain the presence of that fountain at a date so far before its creation." He adjusted his glasses. "But that's just my observation, not an expert opinion. For an official assessment, you'd need a lawyer." Martha was about to thank him and leave when Mr. Silas raised his voice slightly, like someone speaking to the air, but wanting someone else to hear. "There's a young man working here at the counter in the afternoons. Just graduated. Julian Thorne, son of Sarah Thorne from Overlook Heights." He looked at her over his glasses. "He needs a case worth fighting." Martha went to the county registrar that same afternoon. Julian Thorne was 26, with short black hair, a dress shirt with a coffee stain he tried to hide under his badge, and a quick way of talking that matched the enthusiasm of someone who had just started in the profession and hadn't yet learned to pretend he didn't care. He listened to everything Martha had to say, with a small notebook in his hand where he jotted things down. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, rereading his own notes. "The fake document alone won't solve it," he said, with a direct honesty she appreciated. "But if we can prove it's a forgery, plus any other evidence that the stone deposit was made without real authorization, then you have a case." "How much will it cost?" she asked, because she couldn't help but ask. "For now, nothing." He raised his hand before she could protest. "It's not charity. It's because if I win this case, that's the kind of record that opens doors. And if I lose, I wouldn't be able to charge with a clear conscience." Martha looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You have the courage to do this for the community that watches you work at the counter of the county registrar every day?" He smiled for the first time since she walked in. "Exactly because of that." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now continuing. They started working together on what Julian called the dossier, a set of evidence that needed to be built carefully because every hole they left, Sterling would use to stick his foot in. Martha looked at the land with new eyes during that process. She went back especially to the east strip, where the stones with different extraction marks were. She photographed everything again, this time with more attention, following what she had learned from geology books, and it was in this second round of observation that the missing piece clicked into place in a way she hadn't expected. The marks on the stones in the east sector didn't match the extraction profile of Sterling's quarry. She had photos of the material the quarry produced. They were rough cuts, quick, made for yield, not for quality use. The marks on these specific stones were different, more careful, made by someone who knew what they were taking from the ground, and the pattern of the base rock matched exactly the type of soil found in the subsoil of that property. Those stones had been extracted there, on her own land, by someone who got into that soil before she knew what the soil held. Martha felt the ground vanish beneath her feet in a way completely different from the other times. Because if those stones were extracted from her subsoil, and someone knew them well enough to extract them carefully, then someone knew the value of that land before Sterling even showed up with the trucks. And that someone would have had to have access to the land in the previous years, in the years when Arthur was still alive. The idea came slowly, like a fog, and Martha pushed it away at first because it hurt. Then because it seemed unfair to the memory of a man who was no longer here to explain himself. But the fog didn't leave. She stood there small, waiting for herself to muster the courage to face it head-on. She took the photos to Julian. The lawyer studied everything with that tight, focused concentration of someone trying to piece together a puzzle without seeing the picture on the box. "If what you're uncovering is true," he said slowly, "then there was underground excavation on your property without formal authorization, for years. That creates a set of rights in your favor that goes far beyond the illegal dumping of rocks. But it also means my husband knew," she said, in a voice that didn't waver, but it cost her. Julian stopped writing. It could mean he knew. It could mean he was deceived. It could mean there was an agreement he thought was valid and wasn't. He chose his words carefully. There's no way to know what he was thinking, but what happened is documented. Martha stared out the window of the small office Julian used as a meeting room, which was practically a borrowed nook in the back of the county registrar with a table and 2 chairs. Outside, the afternoon went on, indifferent. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We move forward," he said. "The truth of what happened underground benefits you, regardless of who was involved before, and the document forgery is still Sterling's crime, not Arthur's." She nodded. Once, like a silent agreement with herself. But that night, alone in the kitchen with the light off, she cried for the first time since all of this began. Not out of bitterness toward Arthur, more out of exhaustion from discovering that the ground she thought was solid had more layers than she ever imagined. That the land she defended so stubbornly had a history she didn't fully know. That the man she shared her life with for so many years had carried something he never told her about. It wasn't anger. It was a sadness of the kind that settles in after anger tires out. She stayed there until the sadness passed into that calmer state that comes after crying, which isn't joy, but is bearable. Then she washed her face, turned on the light, and went to sleep. The next morning brought Beatrice. This time her sister-in-law didn't arrive with a worried look. She came with a smile that Martha recognized from other bad times. It was the smile of someone who knows something you don't yet know and is holding back from blurting it out, savoring the moment. "I heard you're caught up in some legal matter now," Beatrice said, sitting down uninvited, "with Sterling about the land." "I'm sorting out a few things, yes," said Martha, continuing what she was doing at the sink. "Martha," Beatrice's voice shifted, taking on that heavy tone of someone about to say something serious. "I also heard you found out something about Arthur, about the property." Martha stopped. She turned slowly. "Where did you hear that?" Beatrice shrugged with a casualness that was anything but casual. "People talk, you know. This little town is small." "What are people saying?" Martha asked, in a tone that didn't rise but weighed heavy. "They're saying you're trying to ruin Arthur's memory for money, that you're blaming him now that he can't defend himself." She pursed her lips. "I don't believe it, but you know how it is. What reaches the boy's ears is another story." Martha placed the dish towel on the sink with a calculated slowness. "Beatrice, you're going to leave through that same door you came in, and you're going to stop spreading things you don't understand, not for me. Out of respect for the brother you claim to love so much." Beatrice stood up, red-faced. "I only came to warn you. Consider yourself warned." Her sister-in-law left for the second time without getting what she wanted, but this time Martha knew the damage was done. The words had already escaped. They were already circulating through the community, growing along the way, as all gossip does, gaining details no one added and losing nuances that were essential. 2 days later, Nathan called again. But this time the tone wasn't that of a worried son. It was the tone of a son who had heard a version of the story that wasn't her version, who had spent nights thinking and had reached a conclusion that was already set before he called. "Mom, we need to talk about the land," he said. "Go ahead." "Caleb and I are worried about the decisions you're making. You're alone. You're getting involved in a legal matter with no experience in it. You're working physically in a way that isn't compatible with—" "Nathan," she interrupted him. "Let me finish. I looked into it, and there are ways to—" "Nathan." He stopped. "What?" "You called to tell me something specific. Just say it." A pause. "I talked to a lawyer in town about the possibility of legally contesting the property management decisions if we believe you're making decisions under emotional pressure that are harming—" Martha was silent for a moment, that Nathan probably felt as an eternity on the other end. "So you want to use the law against your own mother," she said, without anger, without sadness, just to make clear what was being said. "It's not like that. It's exactly like that." She took a breath. "Nathan, I love you. But if you do this, it's something we'll both carry for a long time. I recommend you think carefully before making any decision." She hung up, and she stared at the phone in her hand for a long time. It wasn't easy. She had spent years raising that son, and he had his reasons, she knew that. He was afraid she'd get hurt. He was afraid of losing what little was left after Arthur passed. But fear isn't a right. Fear doesn't become authority over someone else's life, even if it's your mother. She put the phone in her pocket and went to work. The weeks that followed were the hardest of the whole process, not because of the physical work, which she had already learned to respect and pace herself with. It was because Sterling changed his strategy. Without her realizing it at first, he worked with 2 local suppliers to cut off her credit. One sold tools and supplies. The other provided gas, which she used in the generator to light the work area on the shorter days. When Martha went to restock what she needed, both gave vague excuses. They were out of stock. There were old pending issues in the system. They needed a confirmation that was taking time, both in the same week, with the same vaguely worded excuses. She understood what was happening, but understanding didn't solve the immediate problem. Without proper tools, the process of splitting the stones became slower and riskier. She started working with what she had, saving every tool as if it couldn't be replaced, because for now it couldn't. Production dropped. She had hoped to get to Old Abe's Township Fair with a decent amount of finished pieces to show some concrete results. Instead, she had half of what she planned, and some pieces that didn't have the finish she wanted. It was in this moment of exhaustion that Mrs. Clara showed up at the property gate on a Wednesday morning, which was unusual because Mrs. Clara rarely left the library during the day. She arrived by bicycle, which was even more unusual, with her leather bag full of papers strapped to the back. "I heard that Sterling cut off your suppliers," she said bluntly, dismounting the bike with dignity. "How do you know that?" Martha asked, genuinely surprised. "Because the son of the owner of the hardware supply store is in the library reading group every Thursday, and when he showed up last week with that guilty look on his face, I asked." She pulled a paper from her bag. "But that's not what I came to talk about. I came to talk about this. It was a flyer, wrinkled with small print, black and white. A mineral and gemstone fair happening in the neighboring country town, 2 hours away by car, in 3 weeks. "I've been to that fair before to look for books," said Mrs. Clara. "There are serious people there, buyers, cutters, collectors. If what you have is what I think it is, a simple booth at that fair is worth more than months of trying to convince people around here." Martha looked at the flyer. Then she looked at the boxes of crystals on the porch, then at her hands calloused and marked by the last few weeks of work. "I have less material than I would need," she said. "But what you have is quality," replied the librarian. "And quality speaks louder than quantity to those who understand." Martha stared at the flyer for a moment longer. "Mrs. Clara," she said slowly, "why are you doing this for me?" The older woman took a second to answer. "Because I'm 63 years old and I've seen a lot of capable people convinced they weren't capable by people who had an interest in them believing that." She adjusted her glasses. "And because I hate waste." Martha couldn't help but smile. The 3 weeks leading up to the fair were intense in a way unlike anything that had come before. Martha worked with what she had, slowly and carefully, prioritizing quality over quantity, as Mrs. Clara had suggested. Each piece she opened, she evaluated by the criteria she had learned from the books and from what Old Abe had explained. Color, clarity, crystal formation, absence of structural cracks. From the pieces she had, she set aside the best ones. 23 in all. Some were small, the size of a closed fist. Others were larger, heavy, with formations that made you stare at them for too long without realizing it. The combination of deep red and intense green that characterized that specific mineral was something she still couldn't describe without a knot in her chest, because it was the most beautiful color she had ever seen come out of the ground. She wrapped each piece in strips of fabric she cut from an old cotton sack, because she had no velvet box and no time to buy one. She put everything in a wooden crate that had once held apples, lined inside with the same fabric. On the morning of the trip, at 5 in the morning, she loaded the crate into Arthur Holloway's old truck, which started on the 3rd try with a noise that woke the neighbor's rooster, and set off down the road before the sun came up. The fair was bigger than she had imagined from the flyer. There were booths spread across the entire length of a covered shed, each with its own lighting, banners, signs, and glass display cases, showing minerals from all over the state and beyond. Buyers walked slowly through the aisles, stopping, examining, talking in low voices with the exhibitors. Martha set up her booth in a simple space she had bought at the early fair, a trestle table, a piece of unbleached linen over it, and the pieces arranged with space between them, on small squares of the same wrapping fabric. She looked to the side and saw booths with special lighting, printed banners, professional labels. She looked at her own table. No decoration, no sign, nothing but the stones. She took a deep breath. She straightened her back, and she waited. The first visitors passed by without stopping. The second aisle had more traffic, and most gave a glance from afar and kept going. Martha stood behind the counter, without calling out, without shouting deals, without doing anything but being there. Then a man stopped. He was about 50, with a well-kept beard, simple clothes that said he had nothing to prove, and he carried a loupe in his coat pocket with the familiarity of someone who uses that object every day. He stared at the counter for a few seconds from the aisle before approaching. Then he stared for even longer up close. He didn't touch the pieces immediately. First, she looked, with the careful attention of someone who stays silent. "May I?" he asked, pointing to one of the larger pieces. "Of course," Martha said. He picked up the specimen, took out his magnifying glass, examined it in several positions, tilting it against the light. "Where did you extract this?" he asked without looking up. "My property." "In the high prairie, near the ridge," she replied, using the name the books used to describe that geological belt. He nodded, still focused on the piece. "Do you have more?" 22 more pieces, on the table." He lowered the magnifying glass and looked at her with an expression that Martha took a second to identify. It was genuine surprise. Not the polite kind, the kind that slips out before a person can control it. "I've never seen this combination of hues in a tourmaline from this area. This is a true rarity." He returned the piece carefully. "My name is Maxwell Grant. I'm a gem cutter. I'm from Silver City. I've been working with minerals for 25 years. "Martha Holloway," she said, extending her hand. He shook it firmly. "How much do you want for the entire collection?" Martha had spent nights thinking about a price. She had arrived at a number she thought was reasonable, based on what old Abe had said and what she had read. But now, looking at Maxwell Grant with his 25 years of experience and the genuine surprise that had escaped his face, she said a number 50% higher. Maxwell was silent for a second. Then he said, "I'll pay cash, half now and the rest in 30 days, plus an advance on the next batch, if you can produce it." Martha was so quiet that he glanced sideways at her. "Is it good?" he asked. "It's perfect," she said, with a calm that inside was a storm of relief and disbelief. He bought everything she had brought. Before she left, he added, with the manner of someone solving a practical problem, "I know a geologist who does informal appraisals for small producers, reasonably priced. If you want me to pass on his contact, send me a message and I'll recommend you." She jotted down Maxwell's number in her notebook. The trip back was different from the trip there. On the way there, darkness, the noisy truck, her alone with the wooden box on the passenger seat, and doubt weighing heavier than the mineral. On the way back, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, the truck as noisy as ever, but now with the money in her purse and something lighter in her chest. She turned on the radio for the first time in months. An old song was playing, the kind that city folk called cheesy but that everyone in the countryside knows by heart. Martha hummed softly for the first half of the drive. Then she fell silent, thinking. She had money. She had proof. She had a contact who wanted more. She still had Sterling and the fake document, and Nathan, Beatrice, and all the web that had formed around her in these months. But now she also had a different ground beneath her feet, a ground she had built herself, stone by stone. When she got home and unloaded the empty truck, she went straight to the phone and called Julian. "I have what we need to start moving the process forward," she said. "What do you have?" he asked. "Proof that the material has real documented commercial value, and the money to cover whatever needs covering." A pause on the other end. "So now it's really serious," he said. "It was already serious," she replied. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The geologist Maxwell recommended was named Graham Fletcher, a man in his 40s, who arrived at the property in a pickup truck full of simple but well-kept equipment and spent an entire morning walking around the land with looks and instruments, some of which Martha couldn't name all of. In the end, he sat with her on the back porch with a hand-drawn map and a report written in language she could follow because she'd read enough to understand the basics. "You've got some promising veins," he said, pointing to the markings on the map. "It's not a mine. You won't get rich overnight. But there's enough material for steady small-scale extraction for years. If you work carefully and respect what the land can handle, this could be a reliable income for a long time." "How long?" she asked. "With controlled extraction? Easily 5 to 10 years. Possibly more, because these veins run deep, and I won't know their full extent without a more thorough analysis." Martha looked at the land. At the stones still scattered around that she hadn't cracked open yet, at the empty wooden crate on the porch. "You'll sign that report?" "I will," It's not official as an expert appraisal, but as an independent technical document, it carries weight. She paid Graham with what she'd made at the township fair and still had some left over. Julian received the report with the eyes of someone piecing together the last part of a complicated puzzle. So we have the forged document identified by Mr. Silas, the photos of the unauthorized extraction marks underground, the geological report confirming the land's value, and the sales record from the fair proving the real market value. He looked at her. With this, we present the whole situation to Sterling before any formal legal action. We give him a chance to resolve it without it turning into a court case. If he refuses, then we go all in. Why give him the first chance? She asked. Because a court case takes time and costs money, and because what we have is strong enough for him to know he can't win. Sometimes that settles things faster than any trial. Martha thought it over. All right, she said, but I want to be there when you present it. Julian paused briefly. That's not conventional. I know, but it's what I want. He nodded. Then we'll go together. The meeting with Sterling happened in his office just like the first time, but this time it was different. Julian was there, folder in hand. Martha sat beside him, not in the front chair but at his side, like someone who'd come in together and was there to stay. Sterling walked in with his usual air, but when he saw the two of them, something in his face shifted slightly. Just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Julian laid the documents on the table one by one, explaining each in clear, direct language. The documents Sterling had presented as proof of land transfer. Identification of a typeface incompatible with the recorded date, confirmed by a professional with 32 years at the county registrar. The photos of extraction marks in the eastern section of the property, a pattern inconsistent with the quarry's production profile, matching precision extraction aimed at mineral recovery. The geological report, significant veins of tourmalines and amethysts in a band that included the eastern section, confirming the land's subsurface had been exploited before the rocks were deposited. The sales record from the fair, the market value of the pieces, with Maxwell Grant listed as a reference. Sterling listened in silence. When Julian finished, he stared at the documents scattered across his own desk for a moment. "What exactly do you want?" he asked, his voice stripped of the usual heavy confidence. "Withdrawal of any claim on the land with formal documentation," Julian said. "Financial compensation for the unauthorized use of the subsurface over the years at an agreed-upon amount, and a signed statement confirming that the rocks were deposited without permission, releasing Mrs. Holloway to manage the material as her own property." For the first time since she'd entered, Sterling looked at Martha. She said nothing. He just returned the look with the same calm she'd used the first time he asked if she had a problem. He turned aside and picked up the phone. "I'm going to need to talk to my lawyers," he said. "Of course," Julian replied. 5 business days for a response. They left the office late in the afternoon. The sun was low, orange, slanting across the dirt road. Martha stayed quiet for a while as they walked to the car. "Do you think he'll accept?" she asked. "He knows the evidence is solid," Julian said, "and he knows a public lawsuit wears you down a lot more than a settlement. His partners were already pulling back before the meeting." "I'd heard that much," he paused, "but it depends on how big his ego is." "His ego is huge," she said. "Everyone's ego shrinks when it hits an argument it can't counter." 4 days later, Sterling's lawyers called. They wanted to negotiate the terms. Martha went to the negotiation table with Julian and came back with a settlement that wasn't everything a full lawsuit could have been, but it was real, it was signed, and it included everything she needed: a formal withdrawal of any claim on the land, compensation for the excavated subsoil spread over 12 months, and the acknowledgement of the improper dumping. She signed with the pen she found in Arthur's desk drawer. It wasn't a calculated gesture, it was just the pen that was closest. But when she realized what she was using, she held it in her hand for a second before putting it back to the paper. Would Arthur have been proud or ashamed? She didn't know. Probably both. But it was his life and it was hers. And hers went on, hers. Nathan called that week. 2 days after a condensed version of the news had circulated through town, the way news travels in a small town. Not with precise details, but with the essentials correct. This time his tone was different from all the others. "Mum," he said, and the word already carried the weight of something that had been prepared for days. "I heard about the settlement." "Yes," she confirmed. A silence. "Can I come over this weekend?" She realized he was expecting her to say no, that he was ready to hear a no as an answer. "You can come," she said. Nathan arrived alone on Saturday afternoon. Caleb didn't come, and Martha understood that the younger brother had left the older one to handle this the way he needed to. Nathan arrived, got out of the car, stood still for a second looking at the land. The sun was setting, orange over the stones arranged in groups on the ground. Over the new wooden workbench Martha had built with boards she bought with the first funds from the settlement. Over the simple shelter of wood and zinc roofing that protected the work area. He stood looking for a time she didn't rush. Then he turned to her. "I was wrong," he said. Martha didn't answer immediately. She got 2 glasses of water from the pitcher she'd brought and handed one to her son. She sat down on the rustic bench Arthur had made years ago from a Brazilian pepper log. Nathan sat beside her. They stayed quiet for a while. "When I was little," he began, looking at the land, "you handled everything on your own when Dad's truck broke down and he was in bed with a fever. You didn't even have a driver's license for that old truck, but you went." "I did have a license," she corrected. "You didn't, Mom. We grew up knowing that." She took a second, then she let out a short laugh. "Okay, I didn't," she admitted. "But we made it." "I should have remembered that before I called the lawyer," he said. Martha was quiet. Then she put her hand on her son's arm for a second. "You were afraid of losing me in a different way," she said. "I understand that. That's not an excuse. It's not. But it's an explanation. And explanations matter." Nathan looked at her with one of those adult looks that still carried the boy underneath. "Are you going to let me help now?" "When I need help, you'll know." He nodded. That was all she could give him for now, and they both knew it. Beatrice showed up a week later, as expected. Beatrice's tides always turned with the fortunes of others. She arrived with a pound of homemade dulce de leche, handed it over with a smile that tried to be warm, and said she always knew Martha would figure things out. Martha accepted the dulce de leche with genuine cordiality because it was good and she had no reason to refuse. But she didn't open the door any wider than that. Beatrice stayed for half an hour, talked about her daughters, the weather, the dulce de leche. As she left, she lingered, waiting for an invitation to see the land, to see the stones, to be included somehow in a story she had tried to sabotage at every chapter. Martha walked her to the gate politely and said good afternoon. Beatrice left with the pound of dulce de leche, no return. With the funds from the settlement and those from the lapidary Maxwell Grant, who had ordered a new batch due the following month, Martha began expanding the structure on the property in a simple, functional way. Not big, not rushed, just what the work required. The wooden cover over the work area came first. It protected from the summer sun and the rain on March afternoons. Then came a sturdy concrete workbench, better than the trestle one she'd used at the fair. Then, with the second installment of the compensation, she bought basic lapidary equipment that Maxwell helped her pick out over the phone, describing what she needed in language she could follow. Old Abe, the man from the township fair, showed up one afternoon with a small toolbox under his arm. "I hear you need to learn how to cut stones for real," he said without ceremony. "And you'll teach me?" she asked. "Trial and error, with supervision," he said. "Same way I learned." Old Abe's lessons lasted 3 weeks. They had no set schedule. He showed up when he could, stayed for 2 or 3 hours, taught, corrected, left. Martha discovered that lapidary was a conversation with the stone, that you had to understand its structure before deciding what to do, that a wrong cut wasted months of the earth's own work, and that patience wasn't an extra virtue in this. It was the whole craft. There was one particular afternoon that stuck with her. She had ruined a nice piece by making a hasty cut, and the frustration rose quickly. That frustration that isn't just about the stone, it's about everything all at once. Old Abe stood quietly nearby, waiting. "I wasted it," she said, her voice heavier than the situation warranted. You learned, he corrected without drama. It's the same thing. No, it's not. He picked up the broken piece and examined it. When you waste it, you throw it away. When you learn, you keep what happened here. He pointed to his own head. And on the next stone you cut differently. He handed the fragment back to her. Hold on to that. Someday you'll look at that broken piece and understand it was the most expensive thing you paid for what you know today. Martha held the fragment in her hand for a moment. Then she placed it on a little shelf she had made from a plank and 2 nails on the shed wall. It stayed there for the rest of the process, like a memory that needed no frame. She was patient. She had trained her whole life without knowing she was training for this. The 2 women from the neighborhood showed up on a Thursday morning, almost at the same time, each coming from a different direction, which made Martha think they had probably planned it without admitting they planned it. One of them was Celia, a woman around 45, who was raising 2 teenage kids on her own. The other one was Daisy, older, with graying hair she didn't try to hide, who had been married for 30 years to a man she called good but quiet. The 2 of them wanted to learn. Martha stood at the entrance to the workspace, watching them for a second. Then she said, "Go grab an apron from those hanging in the shed and closed-toe shoes." They went. Martha was left with a smile that wasn't exactly pride, but a close cousin. The lessons with Celia and Daisy began slowly, just like hers with old Abe, trial and error and supervision. They made more mistakes than correct moves at first, but they came every day, and whoever comes every day learns. The community, which had watched everything from a cautious distance, began to shift in small ways that Martha gradually noticed. The grocery store owner started offering credit again without her asking. A neighbor who had never set foot on the property stopped by the road to ask how the work was going. 2 older men who had coffee at the corner diner stopped looking away when she walked in. No big celebration, no speeches, just the community adjusting its view of someone. Sterling Vance carried on with the quarry, but with the shadow of the deal visible in every conversation he tried to have in the region. The partners who had distanced themselves didn't all come back. Part of the prestige he had built with quiet intimidation can't be rebuilt once the intimidation stops working. He began avoiding the same places Martha frequented. She noticed, but didn't bother changing her own habits because of it. Maxwell Grant traveled to the property 3 months after the fair to see the land with his own eyes. He spent time walking the veins with Graham Fletcher, who came back to complete a more detailed assessment, and the 2 talked for hours about the potential of each strip of soil. At the end of the afternoon, Maxwell went to Martha with a different proposal than before. He wanted to set up a regular supply agreement, with her producing raw and cut pieces for a group of buyers he served regularly. It wasn't exclusive, she could still sell at other fairs too. It was just a guarantee of steady demand, at an agreed price, without depending on the luck of each fair. She asked for 2 days to think about it. She thought. She consulted Julian about the contract terms. She adjusted 2 points that Julian identified as unfavorable, and Maxwell accepted them without argument. She signed. With the contract in place and the structure running, Martha did something she had put off for a long time. She organized Arthur's papers. She hadn't been avoiding it. She was waiting until she had enough strength to do it right. The papers were in a shoebox inside the closet, mixed in with old photos, receipts for purchases that no longer meant anything, handwritten notes the kids had written when they were small. She spent an entire afternoon on it, sorting, reading, keeping what needed to be kept and discarding what no longer needed to stay. At the bottom of the box, she found a letter. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to no one, really. It was a sheet folded in half, in Arthur's handwriting. The same rounded script she recognized from grocery lists and repair reminders. The letter talked about the deal with the previous owner of the quarry, Sterling's father, who had approached Arthur years earlier with a proposal to use a strip of the property's subsoil to extract material he called building stone. Arthur had accepted because he needed the money that year, because the property was going through a tough time, and because the man was trusted throughout the region. What he didn't know, and the letter made clear he found out only too late, was that what was being removed from his subsoil wasn't ordinary building stone. The old man from the quarry had seen the potential in the mineral and exploited it while he could. while Arthur didn't understand what was happening beneath his own land. When he found out, Arthur tried to cancel the deal. The man said there was nothing in writing, so there was nothing to cancel. And so it remained, a twisted deal that Arthur carried with shame and didn't know how to undo. The letter ended with a sentence that Martha read 3 times. "If you're reading this, I didn't have the courage to tell you while I was here. Forgive me for that." She folded the letter. She sat in silence with it in her hand for a time she couldn't measure. Then she put it back in its place in the box, along with the children's notes and the old photos. There were things that needed to be kept, not because they were beautiful, but because they were true. And truths that arrived too late to change the past still serve to understand the present. She understood, and she forgave. It wasn't a decision she made that afternoon with solemnity. It was more like a tide going out. The weight she had been carrying since she discovered the marks on the stones, since the suspicion about Arthur had started to brew, began to lose its density until it was no longer weight. It was just history. His history, her history, their history together. No one is just one thing. Arthur had been a good man who made a wrong decision under pressure and didn't know how to undo it. He had been the father of her children, the man on the Brazilian pepper tree bench on the porch, the owner of the pen she used to sign the deal. He didn't need to be more than that. One late afternoon when the orange sun was slowly setting over the land, Martha stopped in the middle of the workspace with her hands in her apron pockets. Celia and Margarita had left half an hour earlier. Old Abe had stopped by in the morning and left a comment about the finish of a piece that she stored in her memory as a compliment, because coming from him, it was. Julian had called to confirm that the second installment of the compensation had arrived in the account. She stood still, looking around. The stones that Sterling had thrown there to destroy were now organized in groups by size and type, with the best veins already mapped out, with the ones she had already worked on separated in boxes with handwritten labels. The wooden canopy cast a shadow over the workbench. The lapidary equipment sat quietly in the corner, waiting for the next workday. At the back, near the gate, Sterling's trucks had passed months ago, leaving destruction behind. Where there had been destruction, there was now something she was still learning to name. It wasn't wealth, at least not in the way the word usually appears. It was sustenance. It was independence. It was the proof, built stone by stone with her own hands, that the stubbornness many called a flaw had never been a flaw at all. It was survival. It always had been. And that land she had refused to sell, that ground that Sterling tried to make useless, that Nathan tried to convince her to abandon, and that Beatrice tried to turn into a source of shame, was now giving back with interest what someone had tried to take from her. The red and green crystals scattered across the boxes around her caught the last rays of the sun slanting in from the side of the canopy and shone with that color she still couldn't describe without a weight in her chest. The most beautiful color she had ever seen come from the ground. Martha took her hands out of her apron pockets, turned her palms up, and looked at them, calloused, marked by work, but whole, always whole. Then she went back inside the house to make dinner. End of the story. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Leave a comment with your words, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.